Here we are. I think I'm 1 minute early. Oh well, here we are. Good evening and welcome again to Tales and Cocktails. I was wondering, it took me a bit to figure out what to read post-Persuasion, because Persuasion is such an extraordinary novel. What do you follow it up with? Well, I'm following it up with chapter 13 of a book entitled The Age of Scandal by T.H. White. It was written in 1950, which is a good thing to remember, and chapter 13 is entitled Tears, and it is indeed a treatise on tears, specifically in males. So, Tears by T.H. White. Humans have a faculty for believing that their own fashions are right and proper, and that these have been ordained to exist as such since the beginning of time. We have a fashion in the 20th century of considering tears to be unmanly, so we assume that they have always been effeminate. But there have been periods where it has been correct for males to cry, and when males have cried loud and long about a surprising variety of subjects, to the applause and even to the admiration of their friends. In Chaucer, both sexes weep indiscriminately. Troilus cried, and so did the tedious paladins Palamon and Arcite. Almost every bruiser in the Morte d'Arthur would burst into tears sooner or later, and Lancelot wept as he had been a child that had been beaten. The first lachrymose period seems to have reached without interruption to the days of Shakespeare, when there was a slight swing in the opposite direction. Albeit unused to the melting mood, the tragic hero then explained, with a hint of apology, before proceeding to shed his tears as fast as the Arabian tree her medicinal gum. Curiously enough, the reaction against the accepted fashion began on the continent at about the same time, and Sancho Panza was always boasting that he was not a crying man. There followed a brief Elizabethan or Caroline interlude, when only women and schoolboys who had been whipped were expected to blubber. It was in the Age of Scandal, however, that a strange unlikelihood began to appear. The 18th century, that unromantic, tea-drinking, Pope-reading, road-middling, classical age. Surely we should not have expected such dry old sticks as lived in that to cry. But they howled. More than the most dramatic Elizabethans, publicly, for little or nothing, the dueling gentlemen sobbed their eyes out whenever they could. They wrote proudly to Gray, telling him that they had cried on every page of his elegy. They wailed over the sentimental Sterne. They quarreled with old friends in the House of Commons and were led out in floods of tears by admiring supporters. Prodigious clamours and interruption arose from Mr. Fox's friends, but he, though still applauding the French, burst into tears and lamentations on the loss of Burke's friendship, and endeavoured to make atonement, but in vain, though Burke wept too. Walpole, Horace Walpole, to Miss Berry, May 12, 1791. As late as 1815, Creevey was related that there was not a dry eye in the house. Tierney sobbed so he was unable to speak. I never saw a more affecting scene. They assumed office in the newest ministry with the same extraordinary emotion. On Friday, this august remnant of the Pelhams, the Duke of Newcastle, went to court for the first time. At the foot of the stairs he cried and sank down. The yeomen of the guard were forced to drag him up under the arms. When the closet door opened, he flung himself at his length at His Majesty's feet, sobbed, and cried, "God bless your Majesty! God preserve your Majesty!" and lay there howling and embracing the king's knees with one foot so extended that my Lord Coventry, who was luckily in waiting, and begged the bystanders to retire with, "For God's sakes, gentlemen, don't look at a great man in distress," endeavouring to shut the door, caught his Grace's foot and made him roar out with pain. Walpole to Bentley, March 17, 1754. On the same occasion, Selwyn was told that a lady of the Pelham family had not shed one tear. "And pray," said Selwyn, "don't she intend it?" At the theatre, the whole house had to weep if it were a tragedy. It was de rigueur. If not, the play was considered to have failed. Fox would go to Drury Lane to pay Mrs. Siddons the copious tribute of tears. Wraxall. "The tears came into my eyes on seeing a play called Elfrida, being very badly performed at Covent Garden, and streamed down the Duchess of Richmond's lovely cheeks." Walpole to Mason, November 19, 1773. A play by a certain Dr. de Lapp was a failure, but he consoled himself by stating that the leading lady had spoiled his Hecuba with sobbing so much, and that she was really so moved that she fell into fits behind the scenes. Gray to Mason, March 17, 1762. They cried when they were in love. When he was first in love with Lady Hertford, wrote Creevey of his Prinny, "I have seen tears run down his cheeks at dinner." They also cried when they had fallen out of love and were dismissing their mistresses. "I am just preparing to escort the poor little Tondino to Dover," wrote the old reprobate Queensberry. "The sound of her voice fills my eyes with fresh tears. My dear George, j'ai le cœur si serré que je ne suis bon à présent qu'à pleurer." They cried when their sinecures went wrong. The Prince had just given Sheridan the office of Auditor of the Duchess of Cornwall, worth about £1,200 per annum, and Sheridan was most anxious that the Prince should transfer the appointment to his son, Tom Sheridan, who was just then married. What Sheridan's object in this was cannot be exactly made out. Whether it really was affection for Tom, or whether it was to keep the profit of the office out of reach of his creditors. He pursued it with the greatest vehemence, so much so that I saw him cry bitterly one night in making his application to the Prince. Creevey. They had lachrymose highwaymen, who, according to Walpole, cried so much that one could easily have stolen their blunderbusses. Even their executioners were tearful. When the rope was put round his neck, he turned pale, but recovered his countenance instantly, and was but 7 minutes from leaving the coach to the signal giving for striking the stage. As the machine was new, they were not ready at it. His toes touched it, and he suffered a little, having had time, by their bungling, to raise his cap. But the executioner pulled it down again, and they pulled his legs, so that he was soon out of pain, and quite dead in 4 minutes. He desired not to be stripped and exposed, and Vallon promised him, though his clothes must be taken off, that his shirt should not. This decency ended with him. The sheriffs fell to eating and drinking on the scaffold, and helped up one of their friends to drink with them, as he was still hanging, which he did for above an hour, and then was conveyed back with the said pomp to Surgeons' Hall to be dissected. The executioners fought for the rope, and the one who lost it cried. Horace Walpole to Man, June 7, 1760. Nor were they in the least ashamed of tears, but proud and jealous of their ability to shed them. According to Lord John Russell, Lord Holland used to relate that on some occasion, Lord Egremont, hearing at a dinner party of the death of a friend, burst into tears and was obliged to leave the room. While everyone pitied him, Mr. Crawford said testily, "If I hear of the death of a friend, I burst into tears, and if I am overcome, I leave the room." The jealousy of accomplished weepers came to a head in Fanny Burney, who became positively cattish about an unfortunate girl called Sophie Strethfield, because the latter was able to cry at will. It was because Fanny herself was probably the second best weeper in the kingdom and could not endure to be beaten. The third best weeper was Anna Seward, who, on revisiting her father's rectory in 1793, could not restrain the gushing tears through almost the whole of the 5 hours I passed in that dear village. Large tracts of Fanny's employment at court were passed in tears, which she recorded with relish. When a harmless madwoman had attempted to stab the king with a blunt table knife without doing him any harm whatever, the Queen glanced round upon the Duchess of Ancaster and Lady Charlotte Bertie, both of whom had burst into tears. "How I envy you," she exclaimed. "I cannot cry." The news was reported in the palace, and there was not a dry eye in either of the lodges on the recital of his danger. At the evening concert, the princesses wept continually. The Queen, still more deeply struck, could only from time to time hold out her hand to the king and say, "I have you yet." When I went to the Queen at night, she scarce once oped her lips. Indeed, I could not look at her without feeling the tears ready to start into my eyes. The real howl came when George went mad. That old horror Thurlow, a Lord Chancellor of even more duplicity than most Lords Chancellor, spoke to the House in a state of agitation which continued till a flood of tears came to his relief. He happened to be lying. And when allowed to visit the lunatic monarch, he came out so extremely affected that the tears rolled down his cheeks and his feet had difficulty to support him. At Windsor, the Queen glided down a passage drowned in tears, and the footmen, the housemaids, the porter, the sentinels, all cried, even bitterly, as they looked on. It was as bad when the king got better, for his loyal subjects began to celebrate. "I assure you," wrote Fanny proudly, "I cried 20 times in the day." This was strange, when one comes to think of it, and unlike what ought to have been expected in an unromantic age. It was only when the romantics themselves came along that people began to dry their eyes. Here again, it was the opposite of the expected. It was the romantics who began to frown on masculine emotion. They still wept a good deal, but uneasily, like Othello. By Tennyson's time, people felt shamefaced when they did so. Tears, idle tears, they had to explain uncomfortably, before they could let them flow. Unpoetical people even tried to hide them under the bedclothes. "Oh, would I were dead now, or up in my bed now, to cover my head now and have a good cry." In the end, it was positively asserted, even by the poets, that weeping in males was not to be the thing. They were to work instead. "For men must work," stated Charles Kingsley firmly, "and women must weep, and the sooner it's over, the sooner to sleep." The fiat had gone forth, under which we labor today. But will the fashion continue? There have been more sobbing centuries in the past than there have been stoical ones. If this little history of emotion is accurate, then the changes from one fashion to the other have generally happened under a queen, under Elizabeth, Anne, or Victoria. Are we ourselves, under some future Elizabeth II, to revert to tears? Will Lord Lundy be brought back from governing New South Wales? Will the Commons again be drowned in limpid drops? Will some reader of this small anthology write to its author as Mrs. Thrale wrote to Fanny Burney? "My eyes red with reading and crying, I stop every moment to kiss the book and to wish it was my Burney." It is to be hoped so. Well, unfortunately, it was not under Elizabeth II. So we will still hope for a future time when men can weep freely, express their emotions, get out from under this horrible restriction because big boys don't cry. We've put them into a horrible straitjacket. Let's try to let them out. All right, my dears, that is Tales and Cocktails for tonight. And my goodness, I think my watch is gone. I don't know what time it is, but I finished the reading. So, now to start thinking about what to present next week. It's lovely doing a novel. You don't have to think about it. You just know you're going to do the next episode. But we're back to presenting something different, and that's great fun. All right, indeed. So good night. Thank you for joining me. And I will see you next week with something. Thank you again, my dears. Bye now.